Roompact's ResEdChat podcast, where we highlight cool people who do cool things and talk about cool stuff in residence life and college student housing. I'm your guest host, Crystal Lay. I use a she, her series pronouns, and I'm excited to have you here today. Today, we're talking to Dr. Gregory Thompson, who also goes by Dr. G from time to time, and we're going to talk about the topic of campus politics. This is a topic that I feel is rarely talked about, at least proactively, so I'm very excited to have our guest here to share his knowledge with us. I'll start by having him introduce himself.
Well, thanks, Dr. Crystal. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. So I am Dr. G, but we're going to go by Greg today because that just seems to make the most sense. So I've been a residence life professional for just over 20 years. I'm currently at the University of Iowa, but I've worked at a variety of other institutions through my career as well, too, and just have a real passion about helping younger professionals, mid-level folks start to think about how to navigate their careers and think about their own ability to be successful at campus politics and making a difference.
That is so great. And listening to you talk, I was like, I've been in the field for a long time too, and thinking about the different levels and all the different campus politics I've had to navigate. But I wanted to start by getting into what exactly is campus politics. I had a colleague that would say, it's about shaking hands and kissing babies. But I saw you speak at an event recently, and I thought, no, there's more to it. So let's get to why, what is it? And then what interests you about this particular topic?
Yeah, I think a lot of people's perceptions about politics is centered on the word politics and what we see in popular culture. And right now, a lot of what we see in politics is a lot of disagreement or a lot of power struggle or a lot of jockeying for position or being able to control decision-making processes. And I think there's elements of that in campus politics, but like you said, if you boil it down, it is kind of like shaking hands and kissing babies. It's about the relationships we build on campus that allow us to more effectively advocate for students, that allow us to advance the work that we want to do in our department, that allow us to make the connections on campus that allow us to leverage our strengths to be able to either advance our own careers or to be able to think about what we need to be doing departmentally. So it's really relationship based. And I think it's really about how we choose to navigate, show up, treat people, and also kind of build our own brand and reputation with the folks we're going to work with on campus.
I like that. There's so many different pieces to it. And so I've worked at lots of institutions, and I found that politics can really vary based on the leadership at the campus. It can be different based on the state and the laws that are present. And so how do you learn what the politics are of your campus, or maybe more so just your department?
Yeah, I think a lot of us might say that we've had to learn through trial and error and sometimes by making mistakes of trying to figure out what's going on. But I think you really hit the nail on the head. It's really unique based on the type of institution. And there's a variety of those factors that contributed to that. So you work at a public institution, and right off the bat, you're going to have a bureaucracy in place that's probably dictated by a board of governors or a board of trustees, probably has some tie-ins with the state legislature that help shape how a campus can respond or the ways that they're able to go through a change process or look at doing things on campus. So right off the bat, you've got these influences or factors that are even bigger than what you might experience on campus. And you have to have a sense of awareness that that is going to be a part of the political reality as well, too. On private institution campuses, you might have a whole different set of factors, whether you have a religious affiliation that you're working with, whether you may have some trustees that have different expectations, different standards of what the curriculum is going to look like or what's going to be focused on. And so you have to understand kind of those 30,000 foot pieces before you can start to digest how folks on campus navigate that as well. So then you've got all the variety of different folks that you're going to have to connect with. For a lot of professionals, it starts really locally with your supervisor or the folks that you supervise, the staff team that you're a part of. How do they go about making decisions? How do they develop a culture within the department? What are the expectations for showing up at events or your presence in meetings? What are the expectations for after hour work? What are the expectations around weekend work? Does your boss have plans or ideas about how you should show up with campus partners? Does your vice president have thoughts and opinions on that? And so there are all these different folks with all these different expectations. And so we have to go about trying to figure out, one, what are the values of the institution that are dictated by those 30,000 foot factors? And then two, what are the expectations of the people that we are most accountable for, whether that's our supervisors, our staff teams, the students that we represent, the parents that we're going to be working with. We have to understand how all of those factors contribute to the culture of a campus before we can know exactly how we're going to navigate those political realms on a campus.
That sounds pretty complex, right? I think you do have to rely on, like you said, your supervisor, trying to understand the institutional type. You mentioned board of trustees. There's so many different factors. If you were talking to a hall director or entry-level professional, what are the typical things that they can expect or should be prepared for, if you could frame it that way as you think about politics?
Yeah. Well, and I think, like you said, it can really seem complex. And I think for a lot of folks, when we say campus politics, it feels overwhelming because we have all those factors that we know contribute. We have all those preconceived notions. But what I like to tell a lot of young professionals or new staff is you're already doing this. You are already engaging in the behaviors that can make you successful at campus politics. Because remember, we're going back to that key fundamental about this is about relationships, how we build them, and how we choose in ourselves to show up authentically and sometimes with vulnerability to navigate those relationships. So a lot of that conversation, I think, begins with, what are you good at when you're interacting with others? What are your strengths and skills that you bring into play that help you develop the relationships to navigate politics successfully? There's not a secret formula. There's typically not a secret door you have to unlock to do this. But there are levels of access that you are able to get to based on your political capital that you have based on your position. So as an entry-level hall coordinator, you may not be able to walk into the president's office and say, here's what I think should happen. But you probably have some layers and levers of influence that you can pull, whether that's getting the pulse of what your students are experiencing and passing that up to your supervisor, talking with your director or with your VP. I think a lot of entry-level folks forget that we are the feet on the ground. We have the pulse of the student body typically because of how much access we have with them living on campus as well too. That's a powerful piece that a lot of decision makers don't have access to. And so that's a tool to be able to use to navigate, to be able to speak as the voice of the students at times when you're in those spaces with administrators or upper level leaders that don't always have that day-to-day interaction with students. So that's a simple way, knowing your students, knowing what's happening in the building, knowing what they're talking about, what the issues are, the pulse on campus and what's important to them, and then being able to articulate that to supervisors, colleagues, folks up the line as well too. That's an easy way to start to build that reputational capital that gets you more access or gets you to be seen as somebody that's valuable or has information that can be useful on a campus as well too.
I think about data and stories, and the more you can tell the story and create a picture of what's happening with your students or your department, that's going to get you in the door. And it's also folks inviting you to the table. And so the more you put yourself out there, you have folks advocating for you, I think you are better positioned, right, to do some of those things. So I really love that. I want to move into, so let's say now you have figured out the politics, the values, you have a better understanding of how things work. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, misalignment. My values are not in alignment with this department or the politics. What do you do? Have you seen that? And how would you help support someone that's in that part of their journey, if you will?
Yeah, I think this happens a lot for folks, right? Especially with entry-level professionals who are excited about some of those first career opportunities and are really starting to learn that working full-time and sometimes the bureaucracy of our institutions isn't always as glamorous as maybe we thought it would be as we're coming out of those grad prep programs or starting to work full-time for the first bit as well too. So I think a piece that you and I have talked about in the past is you have to ask yourself some hard internal questions. And that really starts with, is this me that's not in alignment, or is it this place that's not in alignment with me as well too? I think because of the institutional presence of a lot of our campuses, we're led to believe that if there's an issue, it's about us, right?
Mhm.
We need to be the ones to adapt. We need to find the pathway through. We're talking about institutions that have had decades and sometimes centuries of ways that they've done things. And so it can be common for individuals to feel like there's something wrong with me in this place. But
Mhm.
that's where you need to dig a little deeper. And that's where you need to have a good awareness of your own values, or about your own identities, about what you want to get out of the experience of working in a college campus as well too. And then ask, is this really me? Are my values out of alignment? Or is this just the place that I'm in? And either answer can be true depending on the circumstances. But I think it's important for professionals to remember it's not always a you issue. Like, there are places and environments where, because of the political alignment of what's happening on campus or the culture, that you may just find that this isn't the place for you and your values. And I think I like to tell professionals that that's okay.
Mhm.
That's part of figuring out your own career path, and that's part of figuring out your own voice and how you're going to advocate for students, to be able to say, this place, this department, this supervisor may not be in alignment with me, but you know what? I think there are places that will be in alignment with what I'm looking for. And then that's where you can start to have some empowerment of either job searching or looking to advocate for the changes that help get you back into alignment of your values with an institutional value system as well.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that realization of I might be the person that needs to leave because this place may not shift. It takes a long time to shift culture. And like you said, there's this historical piece. So it's coming to terms with I might be making that movement for myself. And hopefully, it's a choice you're making as well for you versus someone making it. So Greg, I think we've built some pretty good rapport.
Mhm.
That's your signal that this next question goes deep.
Okay.
So we've been in the field a long time. I would wager that we probably have navigated it, the field and the world differently because of identities that we hold. Um, I identify as a Black woman, you identify as a white man. And I would say that there are spaces you go in where you will have more power and influence because of the identities that you hold. So can you talk a little bit about, or a lot about, right, how identity affects how someone might navigate campus or departmental politics?
Right. I mean, it has to. Our institutions are part of systems that have long held biases, or are part of cultures that have oftentimes engaged in behaviors or oppressive politics that have not been uh, friendly or welcoming or fair to a variety of identities on our campus. And yes, I go into spaces as a white man and have an experience that's quite different than you will have as a Black woman as well too. And I think, one of the political pieces I like to tell or talk to a lot of our younger professionals about is, you have to understand that that is a piece of what is happening on campus, both from your own individual identities and how that shapes how you get to show up or where you get to assert your influence in different ways, but also how that impacts those around you as well too. When I talk about building those relationships, about developing your own values in a culture, that has to be a piece that we walk into, especially with folks that have a white identity or even a male identity like I have. We are in spaces and places still in a lot of institutions where other folks don't have that piece. And so it would be a mistake. It would be a miss for me as a professional and for other professionals to not recognize and understand that, and then use that opportunity to either call attention to the fact that other identities are not present at the table, or to advocate and speak on the issues that we know are impacting folks of a variety of identities on campus as well too. To ignore that is to continue to shut the door for a lot of opportunities to move forward on our campuses or to engage in a different level of pieces as well too. So, and then I have to recognize, because of my identity, sometimes I can do that in a way that's less risky than you might be able to, Crystal, in those situations as well too, because of those identities I hold and the value that some people place on those identities. So I can't sit back if you and I were in the same room and just expect for you to be able to voice the concerns of Black students on campus. That has to come out of my mouth as well too, if there's going to be a continued change in the culture of how that is addressed, how that politically navigates on the campus as well too. So and there are places and campuses where that's easier to do these days, and there are places where that's not. But I really think it's incumbent on all of us as housing professionals to, one, have that awareness of our own identities and how they present in those spaces, and two, to not be afraid to use some of that political capital to show up in ways that challenge the status quo or problematic behaviors as well too.
I think I've said to you that, like, I need you to do my work and to make
Mhm.
this field open or create access. And I think that coalition building, the allyship advocacy is so important. And that's what I heard in your answer. I have been in spaces where I have been expected to talk about the Black experience or be the advocate for an entire group. And so I like the pieces that you're talking about, is that we all have a responsibility to learn how to support our students, and not just our students, but also our staff and each other. I think that's
Yeah.
crucial.
Yeah. Well, I think too, folks have to be willing to spend political capital. Sometimes that means you are gaining in a way, but sometimes it comes at a cost too. And you and I have talked before about times on my own campus where I've had political capital and around issues sometimes related to student identity or race in particular. I've spent some of that capital and it hasn't been successful. But you have to, because of my personal values and the values I share with the colleagues I work with around those topics, that's a decision that I was ready and willing to make, right? And sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes the spending of capital is not going to result in the positive outcome that you want, but it's important to spend it, to put yourself out there, to be able to advance toward the place where hopefully you can impact some meaningful change. That doesn't mean it's always going to happen. But again, it's probably much easier for me to spend some of that capital than it would be for you to put yourself out there in some of those places as well too. And we need all the voices to make those changes possible.
So, going off script, how did you come to, this understanding or awareness of identity? Are there things that you would recommend, or, just where do you start for folks who want to become
Yeah.
more competent in that area?
Yeah, for sure. Well, coming from my background and experiences, it just wasn't something that was always discussed, even in some of my prep programs and some places. I was fortunate to get into some departments where conversations about inclusivity, about equity, about justice were coming up as well too. But I think really what I recommend to folks is you've got to turn the internal lens at some point and decide that this is an important topic that you need to deconstruct and pursue. So for me, that meant attending the Social Justice Training Institute. It meant kind of really diving into my white identity and starting to pick apart some of the things that I had learned. It meant starting to talk to allies on campus, both that shared my identities and folks that had identities that were different from mine, to begin to do my own learning, my own understanding. And so a lot of what we've been talking about, Crystal, it's about relationship building. And I also think this is another place where that vulnerability comes into play to be successful in being a political being on campus or to learning about your identities. There's a great deal of vulnerability that comes out of that. I have had to admit to myself, I don't know all the things. I had to admit to myself, there's probably a lot of examples of problematic things that I've done, maybe unconsciously because I didn't know about it, but also because of just how systems are acclimated for me as well too. So you've got to dive in, you've got to have those conversations. And we talk a lot about, when we're navigating these political pieces, of having, a group of people around you to support you. part of what my own process in that was making sure the people I had around me to support me, that board of directors type, were not just folks that looked like me, that were folks that had different experiences, that were from different races, different gender identities, different sexual orientations, all those kind of rich tapestry of the folks we have on campus. As a leader, I need to be able to have those folks around to process as well too. And not to give me just the pat on the back, but also to give me the push and the challenge as well. So again, I think it's about building those relationships, being vulnerable enough to turn that lens inward and look at where your learning edges are. And then to be willing to take some risks to push, learn, grow, and challenge others around you as well.
That is so great. And I think our conversation has been so great, and you've given me a lot to think about. If you could narrow it down to three tips, takeaways, or maybe Dr. G's
Sure.
top three tips to navigate campus politics, what would those be?
Well, top three is hard for me. I've got a top five because it's always hard for me to narrow down on some of these. So, but I think a couple we've already touched on. I think awareness is a really big piece. You have to have some awareness of yourself, how you are able to show up with folks, navigate these things. But also you have to have that awareness of your surroundings, about the folks you're working with, the culture in your department, the culture on your campus. Think about those pieces and be aware. You and I have talked before in the past about that politics a lot of times is about the culture of availability.
Mhm.
You got to be showing up. You got to have some presence. You got to go to the campus event to make the connections. You have to show up in your hall to be present when your staff are programming. And that gets hard sometimes because
Mhm.
sometimes that can feel performative or uh, you're not authentic in ways, but it is just part of the politics of campus. You need to be seen, you need to be there as well too. One of the things that I talk a lot with my staff and with younger staff in particular is you also have to have this acceptance. Some things are going to be out of your reach to control, at least for right now. But what
Mhm.
you're trying to do is build a culture or reputation that gets you more capital to be able to influence those. So accept that, there are some things you're not going to be able to change, but celebrate the wins when you are able to get in there and make it as well too. And then just that adventure and authenticity. Don't be afraid as you start to build up some political capital to take some risks, to say the thing that maybe is unsaid, to push the change or the challenge that you see as necessary, but maybe not everybody's quite there yet. We need bold leaders going into the next, few decades of housing and residence life. Our students have a different expectation for what our institutions are providing. And here we have a lot of folks that are ready to lean in and do that. But there's a lot of folks up the line that's not always been their experience in the past. So we need folks that can take that risk, be authentic, be vulnerable, bring up the topics that aren't always easy to talk about, and not get discouraged when those frontline forces that have always said no say no, to keep thinking about how to navigate. And then partnering with those folks that are like you as well too, getting to those conferences and meeting folks, reaching out to those colleagues and making those connections, building that support system. That's what we need, and that's what I hope a lot of professionals can take away is to go out, be bold, and take those chances when you see them.
And the thread throughout is relationships.
Mhm.
It's so much easier to achieve these pieces and be in community when you've built that, right? And
Yeah.
you've built that human and relational capital. We are coming to the end of our time. And if folks wanted to learn more about this topic, where should they start? Are there resources that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think a lot of the resources that have been useful to me had just been talking with a lot of folks in the field or my supervisors that have done this. I'm sure there's a lot of readings that folks can find on kind of relationship building, campus politics. You and I have talked a lot about being in tune with your strengths, thinking about those, and also I like to really that board of directors concept. Who's mentoring you in these relationships, but also who are you mentoring in these kind of relationships? No matter your number of years of experience, you should be helping to create this political culture as well too. So authenticity and vulnerability. Brene Brown has been someone that I've turned to, if that's someone that you resonate with. But go out there, kind of find what speaks to you. I don't think that there's one size fits all for learning how to navigate and to move boldly as well too. So many of the listeners of this podcast probably could send out the recommendations of those influencers that they're following, the articles they're reading. There's a lot of pieces that can be inspirational for you to follow along with as well.
This was such a great conversation and also great professional development. Thank you so much, Dr. Gregory Thompson, for joining me today. And thanks for joining us on this episode of ResEdChat. If you have an idea of a topic or a person you'd like us to have on the show, please let us know by reaching out to Roompact, and take care.
Thanks so much.